It's always something special when you have to play against someone who is very close to you, either a friend, a family member, or just someone you've been working with for quite some time. It's round 8 of European Team Championships, and Magnus Carlsen was paired with Jordan van Foreest, and the two have been working with each other. Jordan was one of the seconds of the Magnus team for his preparation against Jan Nepomniachtchi in the World Championship match. So the two know each other very well. I think Magnus also respects Jordan very much for his creative playing style. And definitely Jordan also learned something from Magnus. But what are you going to do when you play against someone who you know so well? It's very difficult to prepare as there are hardly any secrets for each other. Well, let's have a look at the game. Magnus playing with the white pieces goes for 1 e4. e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5, knight f6. This is the Berlin defense, and we have seen already this opening earlier in the tournament. Magnus played it with the white pieces also against Pečák from Slovakia, and in that game he pushed the pawn to d4. That's a sideline, but if it's not like a surprise, and definitely Jordan had checked this line before the game, well, then it's probably not the most dangerous line. Magnus goes for the main move, castling kingside, knight takes e4, rook e1, attacking the knight, and the knight goes back to d6. All very well-known theory, and, well, there have been hundreds, thousands of games with the move knight takes e5, followed by bishop e7, and most of the games they end in a draw. But Magnus wants to go for a small surprise. He played here the move a4, but the question is, how big is this surprise? Well, the idea is that after knight takes b5, a takes b5, the knight on c6 is under threat. If it goes away, then you have ideas to regain the pawn by taking on e5 with very nice prospects for white. So instead of taking on b5, bishop e7 is played by Jordan. White goes for the move knight c3, and black plays the move a6. So attacking the bishop on b5. Now, if you do take on c6, black does take back with the d pawn. That's very important so that you free your bishop and the bishop can be developed, for instance, to g4 or maybe to e6. Both squares are good and black has a very comfortable game. So white goes back with the bishop to f1, and well, your pawn down. You can try to defend the pawn with the move f6. This is very tricky line as it also does weaken the structure. But what you want to do here as black is get rid of that knight on d6, because that knight on d6, it obstructs the d pawn so that the bishop cannot be developed at this point. So the main move now is to give the pawn back voluntarily with the move e4. Knight takes e4, black is going to trade off one pair of knights, rook takes e4, and now the d-pawn is able to move. d5 played, hitting the rook, and the rook goes to e1. Various options here. White may consider to play d2, d4 next with a symmetrical position, but slightly better for white. I don't like that knight on c6. It's not very flexible. So Jordan has a concrete idea. He plays d4. But when you play the move d4, the pawn on d5 no longer controls these squares. And now, interesting switchback by Magnus. He goes for the move bishop d3. Bishop e6, and now the bishop comes to e4, which is possible because the pawn is on d4. White may have ideas to take on c6 at some point to weaken the structure. Therefore, bishop d5 played, and now the move d3. Protecting the bishop, but also the bishop from c1 can be developed. Castling kingside, bishop f4. For you, this is probably a new position, but the interesting part is that this game, or better said, this exact position was seen in an earlier game of Jordan playing with the white pieces. Last year in the Olympiad in Chennai, he was playing with white against Laurent Fressinet, who also used to be a second of Magnus Carlsen. Well, there's a big chance that Magnus was familiar. He must have seen this game of his two former employees. In that game, bishop takes e4 was played, trading off one pair of bishops, but there is no need to trade off the bishops yet. And black keeps the bishop on the board yet, so he wants to take back with the queen on d5, probably. Well, bishop b4 played, attacking the rook on e1. And now there are interesting ideas. I mean, Magnus played here to move rook e2. Just one idea. If you're tactically very strong, you may think, wait a second. Is bishop takes h7 not a possibility? The Greek gift. Well, after king takes h7, knight g5, there are a lot of attacking ideas. If you go back to g8, it's queen h5 and it's going to be checkmate next. So the king has to go to g6 and there's queen g4 with ideas to go knight e6, discover, check, winning the queen. f5 is a move, queen g3. Knight e6 is still a threat, king f6. And there's nothing better than just go for a repetition of moves with knight h7, king f7, knight g5, king f6, and so on. This was seen in an earlier game this year between Niels Grandelius, who also worked for Magnus Carlsen. That's very interesting. He played this game in Malmö with the white pieces against Gukesh, and the players agreed to a draw at this point. But Magnus doesn't want to go for a draw, obviously. He goes for the move rook e2. And, well, there are various options. Maybe white is about to take on d5, followed by taking on c7. So the queen is overloaded, therefore rook c8 played. Protecting the pawn on c7 one more time. Now the bishop is not doing that much. It goes back to d2. And what white is aiming for is the exchange of bishops so that you can try to gain control over the open file first. This is slightly better for white. Therefore, Jordan goes back with the bishop to e7. He keeps the bishop on the board. Clever idea, because now it's harder for white to move the queen and bring the rook to e1. Well, maybe queen f1 is an interesting move so that you can go rook e1, maybe g3, and the queen can come via the king side into play. Interesting idea, but instead they followed queen e1. Magnus puts the queen on the e file. Now bishops were exchanged, and, well, white is having a nice rook here. Something like queen d7 is a good move, but Jordan is a very aggressive player. He goes for the move f5. I'm not sure I would have played that move. It's an aggressive move, but you cannot take that pawn back. Rook to e2, bishop f6. So the bishop wants to go there to protect the pawn. And even though white is controlling the open file, he's not able to enter black's position yet. Therefore, new ideas need to be created here. And Magnus grabs some space on the queen side with the move b4. He's probably intending to go b5 to kick the knight out from c6. Maybe the bishop can come to b4. White is getting some active play, but the queen comes to d5. Nice centralization of the queen, guarding the b5 square, so b5 is not possible. And look, now white played the move h4. So on both sides of the board, he's trying to make progress. And note that black cannot contest the open file with a move like rook e8 because white is covering it with both the rook and the queen. Black played the move h6 to guard the g5 square. Bishop comes to f4, king h7. Now the queen comes to d2. So white keeps the pawn on b4 defended. Rook a e1 is probably an idea. What should black do? Well, you want to move your rook. That's not possible now because the pawn on c7 is hanging. But if you would play a move like rook f7, this rook is able to move again. And I think the position is pretty much okay for black. But they followed rook f e8. Now rook takes e8, rook takes e8, pawn on c7 was captured. Is it a blunder by Jordan? No, not at all. He goes for bishop e7 to attack the pawn on b4 with both the bishop and the knight. If you protect it with the rook, then the queen will come into a2 to attack your rook and the pawn on a4 as well. So black regains the pawn. Instead, they followed b5. Magnus cannot save the pawn and decides to give it back. A b5, queen takes b5, materials even, but white's pawns are a little bit better because they are part of one chain, whereas pawn on b7 and pawn on d4, they are isolated. Queen f4 on the board, bishop f6 to protect the pawn, and white played the move h5. So black has some difficulties to protect the pawn on f5. Well, it's protected by the queen, but you can never protect it with g6 any longer. What should black do? I think a move like queen d5, centralizing the queen again with the idea to go rook e7 looks pretty much playable for black. But instead, king went back to g8. And now what should white do? Well, you would like to attack the queen on b5 to hit the pawn on b7. Strange looking move here is queen c1 to prepare that move, but that's not something which would have crossed my mind. Queen d6 was played and it's more active of course. And well, the queen is looking for ways to infiltrate into black's position. Various options here, and Jordan says, I want to get rid of the pawn. I play the move f4, so that if you take on f4, I'm going to take on h5. Well, there followed queen d7 to attack the rook on e8, but queen takes h5 protects the rook anyway. Bishop takes f4, materials even, queen f7, and now the queens were exchanged. And you may think, well, this is going to be an easy draw. Both sides have a rook, a bishop, knight, and 4 pawns each. That draw, well, not for Magnus. This is the moment where Magnus stands up. He goes for rook b1. He is still having a nice initiative, attacking the pawn. Rook e7, king f1, guarding the e2 square. Now black played it actively here with the move g5, bishop h2. Bishop stays on the diagonal. And now the question is, what should black do? Well, I think a move like h5 should be considered here to try to play g4 and prevent white from putting a pawn on g4. Because in the game there followed rook d7, but now after g4, these pawns, they are vulnerable. It's difficult to get rid of these pawns, and in general, it's not nice for the bishop on f6 to have its own pawns placed on the same color. King g6, rook b5. Black cannot do much. The rook is stuck, defending its pawn weaknesses. h5 played, trading off one pair of pawns. Are you getting closer to a draw? Not at all. King g2, the king becomes active. King goes back to g6. And now the knight comes into d2. Very nice idea. The knight is on its way to e4, from where it hits the bishop. It may attack the pawn on g5. Maybe knight c5 is an idea. I think this is a very important moment because Jordan has a difficult position here. He had one very interesting idea, which he didn't find. It's the move bishop d8. This looks strange. Now, if the knight comes to e4, you play the move b6. And the idea is that, okay, the bishop is really bad. It needs to defend both the pawn on b6 and the pawn on g5. But you're using the bishop for that defensive task. And the idea is to activate the rook via a7 to a2 and hitting the pawn on c2. Probably you're still active enough to save it as black. But there followed knight a7. Jordan wants to attack the rook on b5. So rook goes back and the knight goes back as well, because the knight is just very passively placed. Knight c4. Now the knight is coming in this direction, intending to come to d6 and attack the pawn on b7. g4, rook b5, cutting off the king along the 5th rank. So this pawn can easily become a weakness. Rook e7, bishop d6, attacking the rook. Now, the possibility to become active with the rook, rook e2, was not played, and it's not good because black loses the pawn on b7, wins the pawn back on c2, but having lost that pawn on b7 makes the knight on c6 more vulnerable. White attacks it with a rook, and if the knight goes away, here's bishop e7, and the bishop on f6 is lost because of the pin. So here we see that white is way more active than black. The rook went to h7, and now the knight went around again to d2. Knight a7, rook b1, king f5 played, and now knight e4. This is getting more and more unpleasant. The pawn on g4 is a problem. Also, there are ideas to take on f6, play a position with a bishop against the knight. There's still plenty to play for here. Best move probably is bishop d8, was not played in the game. There may follow something like bishop b8 and tickle the knight, then get access to the b5 square because the knight no longer covers that square. And you take it from here. We see that white is making a lot of moves, but making progress. And I think next will be king g3, king takes g4. This endgame is going to be a torture for black. Instead, Jordan wanted to trade off pieces, played bishop e5. After the exchange of bishops, the king comes to g3 to attack the pawn. Rook g7. And now another beautiful move, rook b6, cutting off the king along the 6th rank. Look at this king. It doesn't have many squares to go to. If you try to get your knight back into the game, which was not played, there's rook b5 check. King has only one square, and then it's knight c5 with a knight fork. You're going to win the pawn on b7, and the other two weaknesses are still on the board, so likely at some point white is going to win another pawn as well. Instead of knight c6, Jordan went for rook c7, looking for counterattack. King takes g4, but now the pawn on c2 cannot be taken because of f4 check. The king has only one square, and then it's middle. In the middle of the board, it's just checkmate with knight and rook, and the pawn on d3 supports the knight and covers the c4 square as well. That's a very important tactical resource. Rook f7 played to prevent white from playing that move f4, but you're not in a rush. You play f3, pawn is okay there. Now even knight c6 is still not possible because of rook b5 check, king e6. And now the move knight g5 wins the exchange and the game. In the game there followed rook f4 instead of knight c6. It's a check, king g3, but now pawn on b7 is hanging. So the rook went back. And is black able to keep everything defended to stop the f-pawn from coming forward? Active king on e5? Well, things are not that simple. There followed f4 check. And what should black do? Well, if you take on f4, you take the pawn on b7. Now it's 2 versus 1, but it's very tactical. Everything is hanging. First things first, the knight has to move. But then the rook can give a check, and the king has to give up the protection of the rook. So that would win the game. Instead, after the move f4, there are other options as well. But here again, king d5 runs into rook d6 check, mate. King cannot go anywhere. While the other square for the king is f5. But then it's knight d6 check with a knight fork. King has to go away and knight takes f7. You're winning. The rook, next you take on b7, and the position is just dead lost. So after the move f4, Jordan van Foreest resigned against his former boss. And that was a remarkable win for Magnus Carlsen. It was his first 2700 opponent in 18 games. Remember, he played European Club Cup, he played the Qatar Masters also. And now in European Team Championships, finally he was playing again against 2700 play, and here we could see his class. Nice grind, winning an endgame, which it seems to me that it should have been holdable for black, but where Jordan made the exact mistake, that's of course difficult to say. Hopefully you found this very instructive video. Let me know in the comments what you think of this game, and of course subscribe to this channel if you would like to see more on the channel Robert Riss Chess.